Hey everybody, Some Gadget Guy here, and we're going to take a look at some video samples from the Nokia Lumia Icon. For those of you curious about such things, the Icon performs almost identically to the Lumia 1520, as both the Icon and the 1520 sport the same 1/2.3-inch sensor, which is substantially larger than the image sensor found in most of our other premier smartphones, though it is a smaller sensor than the one found on the monster 41-megapixel Lumia 1020. But I already did a whole other video talking about the differences between those different image sensor sizes. So let's get back to the Icon. Starting off with some flowers, each one of these things is smaller than my pinky nail, but we see a much shallower depth of field than just about any other premier smartphone, which isn't a Nokia. I shot this exact same scene with the LG G Flex, and that window of acceptable focus is much leaner on the Icon. Objects closer to the lens are blurry, objects farther away from the lens are blurry, and right in the middle we've got excellent detail in sharp focus. In this contrastier scene, the Icon washed out some of the detail in that little yellow flower. This is a difficult test, but I've seen other phones do this test just slightly better than what the Icon is performing here. There's still detail in the flower, but yellows and reds can be really difficult for our smartphones to expose properly, and the Icon kinda smudged some of the detail in that bright yellow hotspot. When a majority of the scene is yellow though, the Icon absolutely nails this exposure. And it's maybe one of my favorite features of Nokia cameras where they're not afraid to subtly underexpose to preserve detail. Without me having to manually manage the exposure, this is a slightly darker scene than you would expect for two bright yellow flowers in direct sunlight. As an example of a detailed scene comprising mostly the color red, we can see the Icon is right at the border of just almost oversaturating the whole thing and turning it into a blotchy, smeary mess. Thankfully, it's holding back just enough that we can still see a lot of crisp, tiny little detail in all of the petals and the flowers, but it's close to being just a little too juicy for my tastes. When the predominant color of your subject is a little cooler, the Icon does a wonderful job of nailing the exposure, juicing the saturation, and delivering just tons of crisp detail for 1080p video. Where we can occasionally run into some problems are in really busy, mixed scenes, and I still wish that the tiny little flowers here had a little bit more pop, just a little bit more pink in them, as I think that would be closer to what these things looked like in real life. But I'm honestly splitting hairs here, as there's only one smartphone camera that I've used which has performed tests like this better, and that's of course the Lumia 1020. Into a bright street scene, Nokia continues its track record of offering up excellent dynamic range. Even with white clouds floating throughout the sky, the rest of the sky is a rich blue, cars on the ground maintain their colors, and white cars don't get clipped. And unlike most of the Android phones that I played with, this exposure doesn't get squirrely. So as a dark car passes in front of the camera sensor, you don't see the exposure change super quickly. This is a problem I really have with LGs and HTCs. The whole scene on the Lumia Icon feels much more stable. And like the other Lumia smartphones and the HTC One, I really do enjoy having a wider field of view to play with. That wide-angle lens achieves a slightly more cinematic feel to 1080p video. In this freeway scene, you can see the Icon does a terrific job of tracking movement, but listening to the audio, we're in for a neat surprise. That quad microphone array that's found on the 1520 and the Lumia Icon does very subtle but very effective noise reduction. So effective, in fact, we can even hear car tires rolling over the bumps in our torn up California freeway. As another example of that quad microphone array in action, here's Andy Suzuki and The Method, they're a jam band, playing in a New York City subway stop. Into some walking tests, there really aren't any cameras that handle this kind of movement well, but the Icon is now top of the pack for smoothing out my hand and body movements walking forward and sideways through these various scenes. That the Lumia Icon has a smaller sensor than the 1020 might actually be an advantage in trying to smooth out this kind of movement. There's just less sensor for all of those OIS servos and mechanisms to have to move around. And anecdotally, the Icon absolutely crushes any of the non-optically image stabilized cameras that I've had the pleasure of trying out. Now for our exposure test, the Lumia Icon alongside the 1520 handles this far better than any other Windows phone we've previously run through this test, especially the Lumia 1020. Unfortunately, I would say it's only about mid-pack performance when compared to other Android devices. That Qualcomm 800 has definitely helped smooth out the blooming effect between bright scenes and dark scenes and dark scenes and bright scenes, but it still feels much more stepped or staged than any of the nice Android cameras. For example, LG and Samsung absolutely nail this test with a far more subtle gradient bloom. I'm happy to see improvement, but this is not one of Nokia's strong suits. What is one of Nokia's strong suits, however, is the zoom built into the 1520 and the Icon. That 20 megapixel image sensor allows for pixel recropping on the fly while shooting video, and allows for the equivalent of a 3x optical zoom, which means at the furthest edge of the zoom range, you're still shooting 1080p video. There is no blurring of detail, there is no image degradation, though video does tend to get just slightly grainier at the far end of that zoom. And another advantage that the Icon has over the 1020 is minimum focusing distance. You can get right on top of your subject before engaging the zoom. So for example, in this dandelion shot, I'm only centimeters away from the flower, and then I am zooming into the flower for a terrific macro exposure. And that combination of zoom, Zeiss optics, and minimum focusing distance gives us terrific background blur. It's a very creamy and pleasant bokeh for a smartphone camera. So especially for those of you who like to shoot tiny objects up close, this is certainly a camera you'll want to check out. The Icon also absolutely crushes the 1020 in our nighttime street scene. We've got terrific dynamic range, many of the lights are properly exposed while the rest of the scene isn't horribly underexposed, but the Icon is much faster at focusing on objects in front of it. The 1020 in low light situations like this can often get confused, and that big lens has a hard time reacquiring focus. The Icon has no such problem. Where we do run into some problems is in white balance in ultra low light settings. Now, I really do respect that Nokia would rather rack up the ISO and give me a grainier image than slow down the frame rate like HTC and LG, where then the camera is only shooting 15 frames per second instead of 30 and everything gets blurrier and messier. Unfortunately, the Icon seems to have a few quirks going on where that auto white balance gets really confused when there's very little light information. And this is the least pleasant low light shot I've ever seen out of a Nokia camera. And why I think it's probably a software problem is when I manually set the white balance, I think the scene improves tremendously. And with our creepy tunnel scene, the same thing happens again. There's just not enough light information for the Icon to make a decision on what the white balance is, so it racks up color and exposure to an extreme degree, which combined with the higher ISO leads to a really unpleasant exposure. And once again, when I put in a manual white balance setting, I think the scene improves. Although for stationary low light shots, there's just no competing against the monster image size on the Lumia 1020. And while the Lumia 1020 ultimately wins the title of best smartphone camera, it's really hard getting overly upset about the 1520 and the Icon having the second best cameras that I've ever had the pleasure of using on a smartphone. Aside from a few quirks in ultra low light, they really are capable of outperforming just about every other phone on the market, including a few point and shoot cameras as well. And thanks to those larger image sensors, one really has to hope that Nokia will eventually unlock 4K video, as I think that would be a stunning combination. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching, for sharing, for dropping me comments and subscribing, and I will catch you all on the next review.